become so obsessed with the things that we want. We can have things happen in an instant. It could be a wrong step. It could be a twist of the ankle, an uneven surface, and down you go. It can happen suddenly. You're walking along and suddenly find yourself flat on your face, whether in your garden, hiking your favorite wooded trail, or even in your living room. It happens. For me, it happened last year on July 3rd. Prior to going to work, I thought I would catch a quick nap on the couch when the front doorbell rang, waking me from a dead sleep. Jumping up to get to the door, I landed wrong and my left foot turned. Suddenly, I was unable to walk. Calling to my husband, Bob, to answer the door, I sat back down thinking I had only twisted my ankle. Later, after I had rested it, I found that I could still not put any weight on it. And a trip to the ER revealed that I had fractured my left foot. I was completely caught off guard. I left with crutches, which would later be replaced with a knee scooter, and a slip to be off work for 12 weeks because I would be non-weight bearing. Things like this are an inconvenience, a hassle, not to mention the pain and agony of it. Sometimes the after effects of things like this last for years. But so often it is not just our physical bodies that trip us up. Sometimes it is our spiritual life, our spiritual walk, so to speak, more than our physical walk. You see, it is the same way when we take a misstep with our spiritual life. It can happen in an instant. A moment of weakness that cripples us, causing us pain and agony, and the after effects of this kind of misstep can also last for years. It is like when we take something that isn't ours, whether it be stealing from a local convenience store or stealing someone else's spouse. Maybe it starts out with you just looking and daydreaming, but becomes much more when your guard is let down. You know, too often we pray and pray for God to give us the desires of our heart, not caring that God will give it to us in God's timing. But we don't stop to think that God may have something better in store for us if we would just be patient. You know, instead we want what we want, and we want it right away, regardless of the consequences. We frequently tell ourselves that we deserve so much more than what we are always getting. And so when we have the chance, oftentimes we indulge or overindulge in things to such an excess that they soon turn into a habit, and later an addiction, whether it be food or alcohol or drugs. After all, we don't like to deprive ourselves of anything. It only takes one moment of our doubting God's faithfulness to lead us into stepping out and taking matters into our own hands. Whether it be to seek revenge for a wrong that was done to us or a situation in which we have become tired of waiting for God to move in that situation. There are so many different ways and directions in which we can step out of God's will for our lives, and it only takes one moment, one misguided step, 1 second when we turn not our ankle or our foot, but our whole being, our life, and our faith into just a big mess, all because of one wrong step. We see Abram and Sarai do exactly that. They make a mess. God has called them to leave their life as they knew it behind, to step out in faith and follow God to a new land, a new life, a new promise of prosperity and blessing. God has promised Abram an heir, and God has promised him that he would make him the father of a great nation. The only thing is that it has been years since God's promise was made to him, and still there has been nothing, no sign of a child. Abram and his wife Sarai are growing old, just waiting. Abram was 75 years old when God first called him to leave his homeland and follow him into a new life. And God had made a covenant with him to give him a child. Abram and Sarah have been living in Canaan for many years now since God had promised them an heir, and still there has been nothing. No sign whatsoever of God's promise to give them this child. So Sarai and Abram, now they have faith, and they believe that God is going to keep the promises made to Abram, but they start to wonder when and how. Their faith is starting to wear a little thin, and their doubts are starting to cloud their judgment. Instead of continuing to follow in God's footsteps, they decide to take a step forward without God. They allow their moments of weakness and doubt to run rampant. They wondered, how was God going to deliver this promise that he had made? This desire for a child that God had promised begins to consume their every waking moment. And it's all they can think about and all they can talk about. And finally, they decide that they can wait no more. They don't bother to question God about the details of this promise that was made. They don't consult God as to how much longer they might have to wait. Instead, all they see is the end result. The child that they have dreamed about and that God said they would get. And so they set out to make it happen on their own. They feel they can't wait on God any longer, and so they make their move. They take a step on their own. They did one of those missteps that we just talked about. They thought surely that they must have heard God wrong. After all, they have waited and waited for this child God promised, and there has been nothing, even after all of these years. And so they begin to think maybe, just maybe, God was waiting for them to do something, waiting for them to make this happen instead of them waiting for God. So Sarai, she devises a plan, the only one that seems feasible at the time. And Abram, she decides, can have her maidservant Hagar as a second wife, and together they can have a child, an heir through her. That was mistake number one. When she delivers the plan to Abram, he agrees. Now, fellas, I'm going to tell you, I will only say one thing about that, and it is this. Don't listen to every idea that your wife comes up with. If you don't believe me, look at the Adam and Eve story in Genesis. That was mistake number two. And wives, I will say that, it can kind of go the same with you. There will be times when I will tell you, don't take every advice that your husband gives you. Abram appears not to even have any doubts about what they are about to do. But instead, he immediately agrees. And so Hagar is soon pregnant with Abram's child, and she starts to become prideful and haughty towards her mistress Sarai. She, a slave girl, has finally accomplished something worthwhile, something that even her rich mistress could not accomplish. And she becomes so proud of it that she flaunts her pregnancy in any way she can. This would be mistake number three. You see, they have let doubts and insecurities cloud their vision and their judgment. Sarah then complains to Abram, putting the blame on him for Hagar's actions and the humiliation that she is now being put through. So now there is marital strain between the husband and the wife because of these actions that they took and the effects of stepping out of God's timing. Abram tells her to deal with Hagar as she will, and so Sarai, we saw, mistreats her, and Hagar leaves. But God has seen Hagar as she is wandering in the desert and tells her to return. And she does return, soon has a son named Ishmael. Now, this is not the son that God had promised them. This is not the son from whom God had planned to bless Abram through in order to make him a great nation. That son was to be born only through Sarai. That son, Isaac, the son of promise, would indeed later be born. But again, only after Abram has waited for many more years. In fact, it is almost a total of 25 years from the time that God first promised Abram an heir until his son Isaac is born. Abram would be 100 years old when his son is finally born. But forever now is this child Ishmael between Abram and Sarai, a constant reminder of the mistake they made, of the misstep that they took. Their future and their son Isaac's future forever shadowed by the mess of a situation that they made. All because they did not wait on God's timing. Now, even now, maybe you have some reminders of times when you took a misstep in the wrong direction, and of the messes that we often make in this life. Sometimes, like Abram, we are left with a constant reminder that never lets us forget that we stepped out of God's will for our life. and took matters into our own hands. Like an incident of infidelity that has forever caused trust to be an issue. Or like in our story, produced a child. Or maybe some people have been left with a police record from a time when they couldn't wait any longer for God to give them that thing that they so desired, and so they stepped out on their own and they took it. You know, too often we do the same kind of things that Abram and Sarai do. We become anxious to make things happen. We hate to wait for anything. We are a society that wants as much as we can get, and the faster we get it, the better. Just look around us. We thrive on instant gratification. Same-day shipping and delivery, fast food restaurants on every corner, and let us not forget Google. But we have to be careful that our desire to make things happen instantly does not cause us to step out of sync with God's timing. We have to be sure that we are praying diligently and that we are focused and intent to listening for God, and yes, dare I say, waiting on God. We have to be careful, for as we have seen in this story today, it is very easy to get ahead of God's timing and out of His will and create a huge mess. Maybe even one that affects and hurts us or other people, especially the people that we claim to love. And maybe it's something that could even hurt our reputation, harm our witness to the world around us. It all takes just one wrong move, one wrong step in the wrong direction, in a different direction from where God was planning to take us. One moment of doubt and weakness on our part. Just one instant when we rely on ourselves to do the things that we want instead of relying on God to get them done. Remember that this is a new journey for us as we travel together, and it can be exciting and it can be thrilling to see where this journey is going to take us. But we also have to remember that ultimately it is God's journey. It is God's plan for each of us personally, and it is God's plan for Saito United Methodist Church. And so we need to make sure that we are praying and waiting for His leading in our own life and the life of our church as we step forward into our future. You know, God had great plans for Abram and Sarai, and God has great plans for us. We just need to be careful. After all, it takes only an instant to make a wrong step and end up with a mess. But the great news is that even when we do mess up, God is still faithful and He still loves us and will do great things for us and through us, just as God did with Abram. We just have to be willing to wait for them. You know, God eventually told Abram that He would be changing his name to Abraham and Sarai's name to Sarah because the time had finally come for His promise of a child to them to be fulfilled. And now as Sarah listened from the doorway of her tent, she chuckled that God's promises would finally be coming true. But she was also chuckling because now she was a very old woman, well past childbearing years, and her husband Abraham was almost 100 years old. She chuckled because there was still that little part of her that doubted that God could perform such a miracle as this. To give them a child at their age seemed to be an impossible, unimaginable feat to perform, even for God. But a year later, their son Isaac was born. You see, Sarah laughing was number 4. Mistake number 4. You know, we should remember to never laugh when God promises to do the impossible. For our God and our Creator can do all things, and His promises are always true, and God is indeed faithful to fulfill all of His promises to us if we will only wait and trust in Him. And the best part is that God assures us that His promises are definitely worth waiting for. Let us pray.